Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.salt.
And I'm Sebastian.moore.
And the podcast recording is a bit of a relief today because we're having a big accounts day at SDP Towers, aren't we?
Right, if we start shouting out some numbers and financial terms,
Yeah.
then that'll be why.
Yeah.
Just
we have our national
warning.
treasurer here just giving us a few pointers and helping us with the
Yeah.
complicated accounts thing.
Yeah.
So, as I say, a bit of a welcome relief, but tell me what you're talking about and people might immediately think that's not a relief.
So I want to talk about this UK-EU Pact that
Okay.
was signed this week.
Okay.
Hopefully I can give a little bit more of a, can I call it like a simpleton's guide to it?
You can, yes.
Simpleton's guide delivered by a simpleton.
Oh, you're putting
No?
yourself down there, Sebastian.
Oh, I'd take that as I don't think that's a bad thing. But I thought I'd start off with a question.
Okay, please do.
But just quickly, what are you going to talk about?
I want to talk about prisons and the whole debate around sentencing.
Okay. So, the question that we received about last week's episode.
Okay.
Do you remember what we talked about last week?
Oh gosh, it's so long ago. We did listener feedback and you
Yeah.
did PR.
Yes, proportional representation. So, if anybody hasn't listened, go and listen to it. Hopefully, and I was a bit upset with myself because I thought maybe I didn't explain it in the best way possible, but had some really nice comments from people saying that was really clear and I understood it a lot more. So, I'm a bit relieved. But we had a comment on last week's YouTube video from Jonathan, who you all know Jonathan. He said, "Hi Hilary and Sebastian, an excellent listen as ever. I support proportional representation all the way. Single transferable vote sounds good. How about making voting compulsory, but with the option that's not currently printed on ballot papers? None of the above."
Yeah, so it is compulsory in places like Australia, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. So in Australia, they have compulsory voting, but I think to us, it might seem like, the police are coming and ripping you from your house and taking you down to the polling station as put your vote in the box. But realistically, it's the sort of thing where there are fines if you don't go and vote on the day. I'm not sure that it's ever really followed up on. And if you look at the turnout for Australian elections, it's 90-something%.
Okay.
So there are a lot of people in Australia that still don't vote.
Okay.
But that compulsory voting idea, what do you think of it?
I'm a bit nervous about it, really, because I think people should vote. And if anybody says to me, I'm not going to bother voting, I would always encourage them to vote, even if it is just to go up and spoil your ballot paper. Because I think just that engagement with the democratic process is good for the soul, almost. So I would always encourage people to vote. But I think the problem is if you make it a mandatory thing, you kind of take that voluntary nature away, and it almost undermines and devalues voting to me.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think I'm a bit of a rebel, so if the government told me that I had to go and vote, I'd say, well, I'm not voting then. But I think if we're trying to deal with the democratic deficit that there is and the fact that people are not engaged with our process at the moment, the answer to that is not to force people to go down to the polling station.
Yeah.
I think that is the wrong solution. I think we have to find ways to make sure that people are engaged and informed about what's going on.
Agreed.
By listening to people talk about the UK-EU Defence Pact on podcasts,
like
things like that.
Take Me Home, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great, good. So that was an aside, the question from Jonathan. Do you want to move on to the EU?
Yeah, so disclaimer to the audience, I am no expert. I'm not sure if anybody is an expert on this sort of thing, but I will do my best to just summarise briefly what this thing was. So this was an agreement that was on Monday this week, so the 19th of May, at Lancaster House. And already I've made a bit of a boo-boo because any northerner listening will say, Lancaster?
Lancaster.
Yeah, I get told off for that up here. Do you say Doncaster as well?
Doncaster.
It's Doncaster, I believe. But anyway, it was an agreement signed by British government, Keir Starmer, as well as Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the EU Commission, and Antonio Costa, who is the former Prime Minister of Portugal, is now President of the EU Council.
Okay.
The former Prime Ministers of Portugal always seem to get into high places. Antonio Guterres,
Yes.
UN Secretary General. So there you go. Maybe that's your route to power, is become Prime Minister of Portugal. Anyway, so they signed this agreement. It's not a trade deal. It's not a treaty. It's a pact.
Pact.
A pact.
Okay.
So it's essentially like a bilateral agreement that you might have, if UK and Canada agree on certain things. Bilateral agreement, it's just an agreement between the UK and the EU on certain areas. So I'll run through them briefly, and I might miss something, but more or less this is a bit of an overview. So there is an agreement on agriculture. And this is to do with we were talking about this earlier, the SPS.
Sanitary and phytosanitary. That's it. SPS.
Yeah, phytosanitary.
Yeah.
But it's basically the standards on food so that we can export food items to the EU and vice versa, as well as steel, so that we can export steel. I think there are certain checks and things that supposedly this deal will save £25 million because they won't have to go through all these checks every year. So that's the sort of trade area. Travel. So we've got this proposed youth mobility scheme that was discussed, which it's not been agreed upon, but they're going to have further discussions about it, and it's to enable young people in the UK to travel to the EU and work for a limited amount of time, and for EU youths to travel to the UK and work. As well as e-gate access, which we'll get onto a little bit more, so that Brits can use the e-gates in European countries. So defence, UK firms can now bid for the EU's £150 billion defence fund, but it ties us into certain things that I know Henry Bolton was speaking about, who's our security, defence and foreign affairs spokesperson. Fisheries, the EU will now have fishing rights in the UK waters for 12 years. I really like this one. It said I think it's in the Guardian article, it said British officials admit that they had to concede more to their European counterparts than they had previously hoped on fishing, accepting a 12-year quota agreement rather than the 4-year one that they insisted was maximum. Which I love that they've gone into the negotiation. This is our red line, 4 years. And they've come out and gone, okay, fine, 12 years by a factor of 3. And then the sort of last thing was the sort of an agreement on the fact that they'll hold an annual summit. I suppose it's a bit like when you have a meeting and your last item on the meeting is when's our next meeting.
Yes.
A little bit like that, so that they've agreed to have these annual summits between the UK and the EU.
I remember going into discussions, into meetings when I was working with trade unions, and quite often before you went in, you'd say, what do you want to get out of this meeting? And the answer was quite often, another meeting.
Another meeting, please.
Yeah, keep talking rather than, things blowing up.
So Keir Starmer has said, these deals release us from the tired arguments of the past and as an independent sovereign nation, allow us to seize the opportunities of the future. A clear message sent across the globe that Britain is back on the world stage.
I have to say I'm very sceptical about all this. It just seems to me Brexit betrayed. Does that make me an old dinosaur? I just feel that it's all the arguments we had over Brexit, that we wanted control of our own waters, our own borders. We wanted an end to things like allowing people into the country to study who never went home again. It just feels like all those things are just being conceded.
Yeah, it's difficult because, he says here, these deals release us from the tired arguments of the past. And I thought, that's the complete opposite of what I take away from this.
Yes.
My takeaway is, oh, wow, we're talking about Brexit again.
Absolutely. Right. Exactly.
And all of the, I guess, more Brexit supporting newspapers, but not exclusively, are very sceptical as well, like you are, and have run with headlines like Brexit betrayed. So I don't think he's right to say it's we're kind of moving on from here. The difficulty, I suppose, is that you might say these are the arguments we've had. What I think is tricky is that we will have these questions going forward, and how do we, as a country, now manage relations with the EU? What process is there for the people in the UK to say this is what we want going forward? And the Brexit referendum, despite it being a clear win for Leave, it didn't say this is everything that we want to do going forward. So it's quite tricky, and I don't envy his position, because I think he's bound to upset people on either side of this. The Lib Dems have said that they think it's crazy we're not going into a customs union, and he's come out and said no, we won't be going into customs union. So he's upsetting people on that side. So it's a difficult position for him to be in.
I have no sympathy with him at all.
No.
I'm sorry.
Can I talk about the e-gates then?
You can. This seems to be the thing that people have got most excited about.
Yeah, and I was trying to figure out why, and I don't know. We just talked about it briefly on the way up here to the office, and to me, it's something like a lot of this stuff, the things that were agreed today, even though it might affect people's lives, people aren't really aware of it. And we've talked about how a lot of the electorate just don't really care about a lot of what's going on, or not. They've just kind of switched off to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think e-gates is something that is actually, that bucks that trend a little bit, because it is the thing. It is a tangible thing. It's very small, but it's a thing that you can see when you arrive in a European country and you go to passport control, as I did at the weekend. I went to Norway, and Norway, it's not in the EU, but it's part of the Schengen area.
Yeah.
And you go to queue up for passport control, and there's the EU and EEA, European Economic Area countries, and then there's all the rest. And what I find funny is that customs officials, I know that they'll have seen a plane coming in from the UK, but even when I've been on sort of third-party flights, they'll be saying UK that way, UK that way, because they are aware that a lot of Brits will be expecting to join the queue that they've always been able to join.
Yeah.
Now, this does really upset people, and it's probably a symbolic thing more than anything. I know it does take longer to get through passport control, but I think it's that symbolism of, we think the UK is still ruling the waves, and then we turn up at customs control and they say, this is the priority queue, you go with the rest of the countries. And I think that bugs people. And so I think this is the sort of thing that people will see as not necessarily from reading this, but when it's implemented, which supposedly will be in October of this year, but it could be pushed back a little bit, I think people will see it as a tangible benefit.
I just think they need to get a life. I'm sorry. I think if you're really getting worked up about that, you need to kind of catch yourself on a bit, really.
I'll just explain that in a little bit more detail, how the customs arrangements are working in the Schengen area. So the Schengen area, and this is just, I think when you start looking at the EU, I think that's the height of complex jargon and acronyms. Mm-hmm. When I say acronyms, I should say initialisms. Most of them are initialisms.
So we discussed this difference between an acronym and initials, didn't we? And an acronym, I can't say it now. An acronym is when it actually acronym is when it spells something out.
Yeah, like NASA is an acronym
because it says a word.
Yeah, whereas FBI is an initialism.
Okay.
I mean, maybe I'm just too much of a pedant, but the EES, which is the entry and exit system.
Okay.
I don't know why they need to shorten that. Entry and exit system is fine.
Often with these European acronyms, the letters are in the wrong order, aren't they? Because it's the French rather than the English.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I can't think of one.
Neither can I now. You've made me put me on the spot.
I know what you mean, though. So in Spanish, the United States, rather than saying the US like we would, they'd say the EEUU, because it's the Estados Unidos. And when you have a plural, you just double the letter up. So instead of saying EUs, they'd say the EEUU for the United States. Yeah.
Gosh.
So the EES, the entry and exit system, this is a way of linking all of the Schengen area,
Okay.
which is not the EU, but it's made up mostly of European Union countries and others like Norway. There are some EU countries that weren't a part of it that have joined now, like Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia.
Okay.
But it's a way of, it's like a free movement area. So if you travel in Europe, for example, you just won't see border officials. If you go from Germany to Belgium to France to Spain, you can travel for hundreds of miles and not have your passport checked, even though it's within their right to, if they wish,
Yes.
which is what we saw during COVID, for example.
Yeah.
So the entry and exit system is a long planned system for like an electronic system for, rather than stamping passports, it'll be like a digital record. So that
Okay.
if you enter Italy and you stay for 89 days, and then you go and move to France and you stay for an extra 30 days, whatever, the French authorities will know that you've overstayed your 90-day allotted time.
Oh, right, okay.
So it's syncing everything up. That's due to come in October of this year.
Okay.
Which is when potentially the British citizens will be able to use the e-gates. So the e-gates are these electronic ones where, I don't know if anyone's used them, but you slide your passport in. It's like a self-service machine.
Yeah.
EU citizens can currently use our e-gates here.
Okay.
So if an EU citizen flying into Manchester can scan their passport at the e-gate.
Yeah.
But it's something that the EU doesn't allow us to do.
But it could have always allowed us to, couldn't
Exactly.
it? Even, so they've only not allowed us to, so they have a negotiating chip.
Yes.
And it's a negotiating chip that Keir Starmer has allowed them to use for 12 years' worth of fishing rights.
I suppose, yeah.
Gosh.
Once it comes in October, it's not necessarily the case that all of the EU countries will immediately allow us to use the e-gates, because it is their prerogative. So one EU country could say, "No, I don't want to."
We want 15 years' worth of fishing rights, maybe they would say.
Yeah, and this is all before the ETIAS comes in. You're familiar with the ETIAS, of course.
The European Travel International Assistance Scheme.
Information and Authorization System.
Okay.
So this is, it's almost like a visa. I mean, they're saying it's not a visa, but it's something that we will have to pay in order to travel to the EU, and it will last for a certain amount of time, like 3 years.
The one you have to get from America.
Yeah, exactly. And that will come in, that was supposed to come in 2024, it was pushed back to 2025, and now is saying the last quarter of 2026, so maybe it'll never come in at all. But that's it, those are the e-gate scenario. If there's anybody still listening.
Yes, yeah. Well, as I said, I do think this is such a minor thing that I really don't understand why people get so worked up about it. They need to get a life.
Should we talk about prisons?
Yes. Shall
okay. So what made you want to talk about prisons this week?
So I think don't you, that last week I did spend a day in prison.
You were naughty, weren't you?
No, I was working with the fantastic Debating Matters competition, who generally organise debates between sixth form students. But they have in the past times, and they have again this year, running a behind bars session of Debating Matters where the prisoners take part in the debates as part of their what would you call it? Their I was going to say free time, but free time's not the right word, is it? Their
leisure time,
association time, perhaps is the word in prison. So last week I was in the magnificent Five Wells prison, and
which is where?
It's Northampton kind of way
okay.
on, I would say. And the debaters were fantastic. It's really interesting. So one of the debating topics that we had was we should accept the risks inherent in contact sports. And you can probably guess that the way in which people in prison approach that is very different to the way in which girls in the sixth form might approach it. Is
it a male prison?
Male prison, yeah. So it was really interesting. And it kind of sparked my interest. And so because there's been quite a bit of discussion in the news this week about prisons, I thought I might pick up that topic. So the reason prisons are in the news this week is because I think tomorrow, we're recording this on Wednesday, I think tomorrow is the launch of the second part of the review by the Independent Sentencing Review, which is a review being led by David Gauke, who is the ex-Tory MP. I think he's a solicitor. He's certainly he knows a lot in this area. Ex-pensions minister as well. There's always a pensions angle. So his first report was kind of where are we now, kind of thing, and the second one is going to go on more to what should we be doing, what should we be changing.
And where are we now?
So, do you have any idea about how many people are in prison in the UK?
Oh my goodness! I had a number it could spring to mind, and I thought that could be way out. My number in my head was 80,000, but
yeah, that's about right actually. So it's probably nearing 90,000 now
Okay.
for England and Wales, plus an extra 8,000 in Scotland, about 2,000 in Northern Ireland. So a nice round about 100,000. We do incarcerate a lot more people than other countries. So I think we incarcerate something like 130 people per 100,000 of the population, whereas in Germany it's like 68, so it's about half. And if you go back to around 1993, we had about 40,000 fewer people in prison. So it's quite a recent, big increase in the prison population. And I think, just to really kind of cut to the chase, why has that happened? I think it's just because lots of new governments come in saying they're going to be tough on crime, and it's really ratcheted up the length of sentencing that we give. So lots of people are in prison on long sentences, and it's just got to the stage where I think probably that they've had a few releases of prisoners just because the prisons are so full that you can't put any more people in there. So the Justice Minister, Shabana Mahmood, who I think is really actually quite good,
okay.
has kind of said that we have to do something to avoid, she used some quite startling words, something along the lines of a complete breakdown in law and order. So she's kind of saying we've got to do something about this. So the question then becomes, what do you do about it? And one thing that they are doing is building new prisons. So I think they're building enough prisons to hold about another 14,000 prisoners. So I'm not sure whether that will be a net figure, because you might imagine that as they bring on new prisons, they might retire some of the Victorian prisons. I think are very difficult for people to operate in current the way that people expect things to work these days. So building prisons is one answer, but I think the expectation and certainly the kind of mood music that we're receiving from government is that there will be exploration of shorter sentences, which is kind of a bit of a reset because of this ratcheting up we've seen over the past few governments. So there's a few different ideas being trailed. One is the end of very short sentences. So one group of people who often get very short sentences are women, and when mothers in particular are sent to jail, it breaks up families. It causes really significant impacts on their families, and there are alternatives to prison for those. They're often not dangerous people. So I kind of think that's sensible. I just cannot think that sending somebody to prison for a very short sentence is a good use of anybody's money, really. And clearly there are these days more and more alternatives. So one alternative is the use of tags, the kind of tags that go on people's ankles, and then you can be subject to house arrest. So that feels like a sensible way to approach some of those lower tariff prisoners. But the other thing that they want to think about is I think they actually call it the kind of the Texas experience. So this is something that they use as an approach in Texas. So it's a kind of progression approach. So you might have a sentence. You might have a sentence of, let's say, 15 years. But actually, you are able to be released after 5 years. That's about a third of your sentence. So that's an even shorter amount to serve than some of the early release schemes we're seeing at the moment, which are about 40% of your tariff. But that doesn't mean that you're just let out with no conditions. So you're let out subject to your having been subject to good behaviour whilst you were in prison. But also quite often can be put together with house arrest for another period of your sentence, and perhaps combined with community service. And this is, I think, the thing that's been subject to a lot of discussion in the press. So Shabana Mahmood is really keen to think about things like using people who are serving a sentence to do things like fill in potholes or collect fly tipping, those kind of community things that need doing, where, it can be quite manually intensive. And the other thing she has said is that you would want those people to be identifiable to the public. So to be wearing high-vis jackets that make it clear that they are repaying their debt to society. And I'm not kind of one way or the other on this, but that back in the chain gang kind of thing kind of started making me feel a bit nervous. Do we want people in suits with arrows all over them, out into the, having people point at them and being subject to a kind of shaming? I don't quite know about that. What do you think?
I think if it was optional, if it was a scheme which prisoners could apply for when, they'd served a certain amount of their sentence, and they could apply to do this voluntary service thing as a way of reducing their sentence, I'd be definitely in favour of that. I think often it can be suggested as, we need people to clear up the fly tipping and to do this stuff on the street, and we've got these prisoners, we can just put the prisoners to it. I think often it can actually be harder to implement and be more time consuming and cost more than it's worth. These sorts of things, but neither the actual what would you call that, the idea of it, I'm broadly in favour of. I think
including the shaming bit.
Well, I think it's all depends on how you do it. So if it is a voluntary thing in which you have, in order to do it, you're going to wear a high vis that says community support scheme, or you call it something that people, and then you explain to the public what it is, and if there's support for it, it can be something that is, ties people together. I mean, just on it, like, this is a slightly more tangential thing, but do you remember the Rishi Sunak's idea of voluntary service, national service?
I do,
that he sort of whipped out at the last minute during the general election. I remember people saying to me, young people, they said, I actually quite like the idea of that. It's just a shame that he doesn't believe in it, or it's not a serious, well thought out thing. Because if you actually, stripped it back and said, okay, the essence of this is quite a good idea, let's implement it in a proper way, I think a lot of people would be in favour of it.
Yes.
Same with something like this, the prison thing. And sort of, apologies for sounding a bit like a Daily Mail journalist, but one solution perhaps for if we're struggling for prison space is to stop imprisoning people that have made tweets that the government doesn't like.
Indeed.
Lucy Connolly just lost her appeal this week.
Yes.
Who's the person that tweeted something about asylum hotels.
Yeah.
That was awful.
Yes, it was.
That we've said before was awful. But there's no way in my mind she should be in prison.
For 3 years, no, absolutely. Do you know what the things that people are most often in prison for? Do you want to have a guess about how it kind of breaks down? The kind of thing, offences that people are...
Theft.
Theft and... I in my little pie chart, I put theft and robbery together. It's about 20%.
Okay.
What's the difference between theft and robbery?
That's the reason for my facial expression.
So I think, as I understand it, theft is where somebody robs something without any violence being So robbing a house with nobody in it is theft. Robbery is when somebody comes up to you on the streets and puts a knife at your throat and takes your wallet.
Okay. I saw somebody not too long, a few months ago. I think he was a homeless guy getting kicked out of a co-op for having stolen things, and I was shocked by how sort of routine it was, where the security guard was saying, "Go on, clear off," and he, rather than saying, "Oh yeah, fair enough," and a bit sheepish, the homeless guy that had just tried to steal things started shouting at him. And I thought, this is so weird that there's not even a stigma around stealing stuff anymore.
Weird. What's the biggest group of people, do you think, in prison?
Bigger than theft?
Yeah, theft and robbery put together, yeah.
Is it violence?
Yeah, so that's... You would kind of hope, wouldn't you, that the kind of people they are going to put inside are people who've been violent in the past. So it's about 30% of people subject to, who are in prison are there because of violent offences. And then there's about 20% for sexual offences, which includes some violent offences, so that goes all the way from rape to like voyeurism. So, big range of things there. About 20% for drug offences. And I said 20% for theft and robbery. So if you put all those together, that's about 90%. So whilst there are some people in prison for tweets, and they shouldn't be, the vast majority of people are in for proper offences, if you want to put it that way.
Oh, it's staking my claim to work for the Daily Mail as a journalist, and you tore me down. I think prisons, and we talked about this in relation to the education system, to the health service, that I was astonished when, upon the government learning that we had no prison places left, their solution was, we'll just release people. And I think that at some point, as a country, we're going to have to say, right, stop, hold on a second, guys.
Yeah.
We need to fix things.
Yeah.
Right? Because the answer to prisons being full is not release people.
Well, interestingly, again, Shabana Mahmood did say that if your prisons are full, you can do one of two things. You can close the front door, or you can open the back door.
Meaning?
So you can stop admitting anybody else.
Yeah.
You can stop allowing anybody new in, or you can let some of the people who are already there out.
Or seriously, think about, because if it's that much of a problem that we're saying, well, you can let people out or you can stop imprisoning people, I'd say that's a national security issue, where we're no longer able to imprison people that are committing violent acts against other people. Yeah. That's the point where we go, right, let's lock everything down, let's implement a building strategy to build new prisons, let's figure out rehabilitation systems, all of the stuff. But as usual, British politics of the last 10, 15 years feels like, oh, we'll just tweak this over here and we'll do this thing here. And I think the average person is shocked to find out something like that the solution to prisons being full is we're going to release some people early. Yeah. And I'm sorry to jump in, but I actually think short sentences are awful. Often they're found to be more detrimental and more likely to those people are going to reoffend because they've been in prison.
Exactly.
And I think that there should be process for which people can become rehabilitated and potentially get let out early. I think the Texas idea you were talking about. Yeah. It's a bit scary when you sort of say there's a system in Texas that we think we should implement in prisons. Exactly. Like, okay, like shotguns and stuff, I don't know. But no, I'm all for that. But I think we just have to get to grips with the underlying foundational problems with why we're in this mess in the first place.
I agree. And I do think that part of the reason is there's very much longer sentences than other countries typically have. Including there are some people, who have indefinite sentences.
Yeah, that was brought in by David Gauke.
Yeah. And whilst that doesn't apply to any new prisoners, there are still some prisoners that applies to. IPP, I can't quite remember what IPP stands for, but it's those prisoners. So I think the idea of a full review of sentencing is a good idea. I hope that the work that David Gauke and his commission have done is good, and I think we'll find part of that out this week. I think there's a third part of his review that we have to wait till later in the year for, so maybe we don't know the full story until then.
I like David Gauke.
I do actually. Yeah.
He's an arch Remainer, of course.
Yeah, well, sometimes you can put those differences to one side.
That's the note we should end on.
Indeed.
Put one's differences aside.
So thanks for listening, everybody. We're going to get back to the accounts now. So as always, review, rate, subscribe to the show, tell all your friends about it, and we will see you again next week.